first coronavirus case, the total count is getting closer to 10 million. But the rise in cases is not as bad as what we saw in July, August and September. Active cases were dropping for a month, but in the last few days, they have started to inch higher. Delhi currently has over 40,000 active cases, followed by Bengaluru with over 18,000 cases. Pune, Thane and Mumbai have more than 12,000 active cases each. All other cities have active cases below 10,000. That is, of course, the official data. Now, there is hope of a vaccine. Pfizer and Moderna have reported more than 90% efficacy. Today, Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is the big hope for large countries and the developing world like India, has reported that vaccine could be 90% effective in a particular dosing regimen. Overall, the vaccine was over 70% effective. Any vaccine with 50% efficacy can be approved by the drug regulators. So where are we in the COVID curve and the vaccine race, and can we expect to shorten the arm anytime soon? India's three most well-known doctors who are fighting this pandemic from the front lines have penned a book to share their experiences and document what has been an unprecedented time in the country's history. Joining me now are the authors themselves of Till We Win, India's Fight Against the COVID-19 Pandemic, Dr. Chandrakant Laharia, Dr. Gagandeep Kang, and Dr. Randeep Guleria. Doctors, many thanks for joining us. In the middle of a pandemic, how do the three of you who are at the forefront of this COVID battle find the time to write a book? Dr. Kang, let me start by asking you that.
I think the credit really goes to Chandrakant, who kind of pushed to get all of us to agree and did the bulk of the work. And then we took on the responsibility of editing the chapters that were most relevant to the areas that we were working on. So I think ultimately it wound up being shared responsibility, but he did the pushing.
Okay, so let me go to the man who's done the pushing, Dr. Chandrakant Laharia. Dr. Laharia, 9 months into the pandemic, not just here in India, but world over, there is so much that we perhaps know more of about the COVID virus, but there's so much that we don't know, and we're still learning every step of the way. There is so much back and forth on what works as far as protocols are concerned, what doesn't, how does it transmit, what leads to transmission risks, and so on and so forth. How hard was it for you to be able to put this together to provide a comprehensive and a cohesive look at where we currently stand in the battle against COVID? To your mind, what is the single biggest lesson in our approach in dealing with the pandemic so far?
Thank you. So to answer this question, how hard it was, I'll go back to the previous question that how we found the time and how hard it was. So the answer is why we need to write this book. And the reasons were very many and compelling ones. One, we realized that there is a lot of misinformation going on around. And if we have to fight the pandemic, we have to really provide and empower people with the right kind of information. So we felt the urgent need that people should be empowered with the correct information. And that was one reason we thought we should write the book. Second reason was that there was a lot of discourse and discussion around health and health system strengthening. And it was everybody from the policymaker, politicians to journalists, technical experts, and everybody was talking about it. And we never wanted to miss that opportunity that this should not be restricted to only the discussion of the day, but it should be carried forward. And we wanted to clarify a few things. So, but another reason we had, and we did not know at that time, that pandemic, how long the pandemic would last. But we, all three of us, and Dr. Kang was really kind in giving credit to me, but Dr. Guleria, Dr. Kang has put a lot of effort, and this is a teamwork. But the most important reason was we saw this as unprecedented opportunity in India to talk about how India's healthcare system can be strengthened. So what we have done, to summarize my point, that while we have provided the background information, but from every stage of pandemic, pre-lockdown, lockdown, unlock, we have derived lessons. And we say that while we will definitely win against pandemic, but the victory will be incomplete if we don't derive those lessons and carry those forward. That was the reason we wrote this book, and we had to find the time.
Yes, I understand. And you have dedicated the last few chapters in the book to talk about getting India to be future ready. Because as you point out, a pandemic is going to be an inevitability that we are going to have to deal with. And this is probably not going to be the last. But Dr. Guleria, let me ask you, because in the book you talk about the fact that there have been stumbles, but we found a way to get up and start walking again. The pandemic is long way from being over. Let me ask you this in the context of the fact that you're now heading a central team that is looking at one of the 4 states that the government has identified as states that require special intervention and attention. Where are we currently? You know, post-Diwali, we've now started to see once again a rise in active cases. How concerned are you about what's happening today?
This is a cause of concern because in many states there is a rise in number of cases, and as we know, there are multiple factors. We've just had the festive season in most parts of the country, and that has led to crowding and significant decrease in what we would say is COVID-appropriate behavior because of COVID fatigue having set in large number of our own citizens. Also, the weather has changed, and this is a weather where we see a spike as far as respiratory viral infections are concerned. And in certain parts of India, pollution itself has also contributed to some extent to increase the number of cases and the severity of disease. So I think there is a need now for us to really see how we can keep the numbers down. If you look at the national figures, they still are less than 50,000 per day, which is almost half of what we had a few weeks ago. The challenge is to maintain that during the winter months.
Yeah.
And I think that is the challenge that we face over the next few weeks. Therefore, it's important that we identify states which are likely to be hotspots, work aggressively, look at innovations, both in terms of trying to see how we can get the number of cases down, at the same time making sure that the health infrastructure is resilient enough and is provided for, so that if there is a spike and this will lead to an subsequent increase in number of cases, the healthcare can manage the increased number of cases so that our mortality continues to be low. So this is, I think, a strategy which the government is trying to look
Okay.
at a state-wise level.
Dr. Kang and Dr. Guleria, I want to get both of you on this issue because this is now a debate that is raging across the world. You've got the Great Barrington Declaration talking about lockdown policies, saying that they produce a devastating impact on the short and long-term policies of public health. So let's start by addressing that. We've seen now restrictions being imposed in many countries across the world. In India as well now, states are resorting back to night curfews and so on and so forth at this point in time. Dr. Kang, you know, this business of lockdowns, weekend lockdowns, night curfews, I mean, is there a lesson to be learned from the manner in which the lockdown has been used, perhaps as a blunt instrument to your mind?
I think your description of lockdowns as a blunt instrument is perfect. And I don't think it's what we need anymore. Because if we look at what needs to change, it really is human behavior. How do you acquire the infection? You acquire the infection when people spend time with other people. How do you make sure that that does not happen? And if it has to happen, what are the interventions you can put in place to decrease spread? We know what they are: physical distancing, mask wearing, and making sure that people who are symptomatic or contacts are tested as early as possible and appropriate action taken when they are identified to be infected, which is largely around making sure that they are not in contact with other people and their medical condition, if there is one, is managed appropriately. So that's not a lockdown. The idea of a night curfew, the idea of closing facilities is essentially to prevent people from coming in contact with each other. As long as we are sensible about that, I don't really see a need for a lockdown. But it's difficult to ensure that people behave the way they are supposed to be behaving.
Yes, that of course is one of the challenges that we face. But let me then address that issue. If you're saying lockdowns are not needed in India anymore, and there is, as I pointed out, a debate worldwide on how effective lockdowns really are and the downside of lockdowns. But Dr. Guleria, one of the challenges that India has faced is testing. Yes, our numbers have gone up significantly in the last few months, and the problem, however, is that there is a disparity when it comes to testing. Some states are testing aggressively and some are not. Some are transparently releasing testing data, others are not. Is that not a big challenge?
Testing is a challenge. The government has addressed it to a large extent. But I do agree with you that health being a state subject, it will vary from state to state based on the infrastructure and the policy the state adopts. I know that in the beginning, some states were not that aggressive as far as testing was concerned. They had a different policy in mind that which subsequently they had to change because they realized that what really matters is to really test, track and treat individuals. That has become very, very important even now, because if you have to decrease or contain the infection in a community, you have to be able to test and be able to isolate or quarantine people who are infected or are close contacts, so that you break the chain of transmission. Some states initially had thought of that if you are allowing the infection to spread, especially in the younger age group, you may achieve what they thought was herd immunity, and that is why testing was not done that aggressively. I think most states have realized that testing is now very, very important. It's imperative. And you can't hide your numbers because it will become really very obvious. And this has now become a standard policy, and that is why the testing has gone up. But the testing strategy also has to be focused. It has to be focused to really answer a question that you raise, that what is the cause, what are the cases here, how do you decrease the numbers, where should you do the testing, and where should you position the type of test that you have. We have the rapid antigen test, which is very useful in areas where the infection rate is high and helps you in giving you a diagnosis in 15 minutes or so. But you can have false negative tests also there. So it must be backed up with an RT-PCR based test.
Correct.
So it's important to really understand the test and how do we position them. And testing strategy has to be one of the mainstays as far as trying to contain this pandemic is concerned.
Dr. Kang, let me pick up on the point that was made there by Dr. Guleria that, states are now testing, and beyond a point, you cannot hide the numbers. But do the numbers that we see every morning at 8 a.m. released by the Health Ministry actually give us an accurate picture of what is happening on the ground? Because if you take a look at what the Sero surveys suggest, then the number of those infected or exposed is significantly higher than the daily numbers that we track. So do these daily numbers beyond a point really provide any real input for decision making?
So I think the numbers are valuable in the sense that they show us trajectories. Are we identifying every last infection that happens in this country? No, we are not. And we know that, it's not
No, but are we even close to identifying? Are we anywhere close to identifying the real number?
No, we are not. Because when you have an infection that spreads asymptomatically and where people are not going to have symptoms when they are infected, then how do you ensure that all of them get tested? It's impossible. And this is not just for this virus, it happens with many other viral infections as well. Now what we look at is among the people who are symptomatic, are they being tested? That's important.
Yeah.
And can we track the proportion of symptomatic people who are tested and look at test positivity rates among them? If the rates are high, then we are obviously not testing enough. And if the rates go down below 5% and preferably below 3%, then you know that you are catching the bulk of the symptomatic cases. So these are rough numbers. They are not perfect, but they give us a sense of spread in the community.
Yes, they do give us a sense of the spread in the community. But let's talk about the road ahead. And that is what, Dr. Chandrakant, you said that the purpose, or one of the purposes behind penning this book was actually to ensure that we learn the lessons from this experience and we are future ready to deal with pandemics ahead. Now, in terms of healthcare budgets, in terms of healthcare spending, in terms of community participation, and not just focusing or obsessing with hospitals, what do you believe will need to be the order of priority as we move forward?
Even before this pandemic, a number of challenges in Indian healthcare system were well known and documented. We have National Health Policy 2017, which identified that Indian health system is underfunded by the government. India spent around 1.15% of GDP. Indian government spend on health, which is one of the lowest in the world. And the National Health Policy had itself proposed that it should go to 2.5% of GDP. The challenges in short supply of medicines, human resources, those were many of those were known. India also committed to something which we say universal health coverage, that everyone, everywhere should receive the kind of health services which they need without any financial cost or within affordable cost. So some challenges were already known, but the pandemic has once again exposed the healthcare system challenges. If there was a shortage of PPE, personal protective equipment, in the beginning of pandemic, it simply reflects the shortage of supply across the health system. But it also shows the hope that if a shortage of PPE can be addressed in such a short time, then other shortages can also be addressed in the health system if there is a willingness. So what has happened with this pandemic, that there is a high level of political leadership from both union and state government. Now the Prime Minister, Chief Minister, Health Minister, and every citizen is talking about it. What is also learned that the importance of stronger health system, more specifically the role of primary healthcare system. Like we know now, and I'm repeatedly saying this whenever I talk, that the countries which have successfully contained the virus and pandemic are the ones which have a health system based on stronger primary healthcare network. And I would not elaborate, this is written in detail in book, but India has a vast network of primary healthcare system, but functioning is suboptimal. There have been efforts started under Ayushman Bharat program, health and wellness centers, but now this pandemic has given us opportunity that we really need to accelerate. And let me complete two more parts. What it has given, that we often, and people often think, that healthcare is a medical care. If somebody gets sick, provide him treatment. But that's a wrong assumption. If we focus on treatment and building hospitals, this will be a never-ending and ever-losing battle. We need to have a preventive, promotive health services. We need to have a public health laboratory testing services. We need to have people going to the community. So second point is that public health system need to be strengthened, and we have elaborated. And third part is, and which I would say, that which is learning, that we need to build on community participation, we need to strengthen mental health care services. So there are ample of learning. And closing this, as India approaches 75th year of independence, and as we aim for a healthy nation, I think this is the time we should work together. And that's what we elaborate in the book. The entire chapter is dedicated on converting this challenge as an opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. There are many lessons to be learned, and hopefully we should be able to move forward and put some of those learnings into action. And you're absolutely right in terms of focusing on primary healthcare, preventive healthcare, and of course, community participation as well. But Dr. Kang, one of the issues, if I could link that to the conversation that we just had, is also the issue of communication. From the start of the pandemic, which saw this massive fear, stigmatization to where we are today, the communication strategy perhaps ought to have been a little more consistent. And in terms of transparency from regulatory agencies, government bodies, perhaps there ought to have been more transparency as well, which would have then helped bring out a consistent message. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I would add to that, connecting to what Chandrakant said earlier, your primary healthcare system is the foundation of any healthcare system in any part of the world. What having a strong primary healthcare system allows you to do is to build trust in the community. And I think when we trust a system, we understand and accept its messages much better. Whereas if we go to the system, the healthcare system, as I have no other choice, I have no resources to go elsewhere, which is the way our primary healthcare system is at the moment, then you really do not trust that system. And messaging coming from that system will obviously be suspect. So respecting people to whom we provide services is important, so that you can communicate with them better. And trust needs to be built in healthcare systems, so that when there is messaging in the time of a pandemic, it's not like you need to build that trust as you are communicating.
Yes. Dr. Chandrakant, one of the other aspects, and I would imagine that this will also require a great degree of research. While we have focused on what is happening in the US, what's happening across Europe, where the virus has had a significant impact, a debilitating impact on healthcare services, mortality rates very high, what's happened in our own neighborhood, in the Asian and the East Asian region, is very, very different. Do you believe that there are lessons to be learned on the manner in which this part of the world has also addressed the pandemic?
Of course, that's what we and the entire world is looking at. So Asian system or some of the healthcare system which have handled it well are based upon what we discuss on the foundation of primary healthcare system. Let's take an example of Thailand. Thailand started investing in the primary healthcare system around 1971 onward. And they built a system. They had more human resources. They started training those human resources, and then they started other components later on. When SARS happened, SARS in 2002 to 2004, those countries further learned. They learned that they need a dedicated workforce which can conduct surveillance. They need workforce which can have a laboratory testing services. So they started building community-based system. But this is what is also equally important to learn from Asian countries, the participation of the people. As we are hearing that in some of the European countries, it's a resistance and not accepting what the appropriate public health measure or COVID appropriate behavior. But in some of the South Asian countries, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, the people are adhering to mask by like in the range of 95%, and that's what is making difference. So in this pandemic, the key learning are many, but one of these is that people's participation, public health measures, and designing and implementing those interventions together. This entire pandemic, of course, there is a role of treatment and vaccines which will come, but till now it has been fought on people's participation, public health interventions, and primary health care. And we should carry these lessons in the future. And I want to quickly reflect that what has worked in pandemic, the people adopted some behavior. The same can be applicable for, let's say, non-communicable diseases. We know that diabetes and hypertension, the major modifying factors are healthy diet, regular physical activity, no smoking, and moderate and no use of alcohol. So these are also dependent upon people. If we can carry these lessons and government can use those messages, we can actually convert another silent pandemic of non-communicable diseases and halt that. So there would be many more learning. Our book is not technical, but we have reflected upon it. The way we have done contact tracing in this pandemic, if same can be done for tuberculosis program, India can achieve the TB elimination by 2025.
Right. You're absolutely right. There are lessons that should be taken forward. But Dr. Kang, at the start of the book, you also talk about the fact that while we're dealing with the health crisis, we're also dealing with what I think the authors called an infodemic. So the barrage of information that is coming to us from, from mainstream media, from WhatsApp forwards and what have you. What now, 9 months into the pandemic, Dr. Kang, what have been the big myths around COVID that you would like to clarify on?
You mean everything from this is engineered in a laboratory to chlorine and ultraviolet light will help you solve the problem? I think the most important thing is that, the idea of credible communication. of making sure that the messaging that we have is based on science and not on assumptions is very, very important. So when something is not rational, something is not biologically plausible, and credible scientists counter that misinformation, I think that is a message that needs to be amplified just as much as misinformation is amplified. The list is too long, so we won't go into all of that.
There has been plenty of misinformation, Dr. Kang, as you point out. But Dr. Guleria, one of the lessons perhaps that is worth taking forward is to continue to have a national task force that looks at healthcare. We have a national COVID task force which is looking at how India should respond to the pandemic, evolving our strategy, given the fact that health is a state subject. Better coordination, lessons to be learned from one state to another. Do you believe that we should institutionalize a national health task force?
I think so. More importantly, we should have a special health cadre which can actually look at how healthcare can be comprehensively provided, whether it be at a primary level, secondary level, or a tertiary level, and how it can be lessons learned from one state can be translated to other states, keeping the local environment in mind. And at the same time, good surveillance can be done. It's not only for infectious diseases, but even for non-communicable diseases. We have a huge burden of disease as far as NCDs are concerned: diabetes, hypertension, chronic respiratory diseases. So for all of that, there has to be a collated effort. And I think for that, a task force, a good surveillance system, and a health cadre which can actually build on what we've learned from the last few months in terms of taking things forward. This is possibly not the last pandemic that one could see. We've been having outbreaks of a large number of viral infection over the last 15 years. And therefore, we need to prepare ourselves better for the future also.
Yes, we do. Dr. Kang, I'm going to give you the final say, because since we're talking about busting myths here on the program, I think there is a fair degree of skepticism and concern around vaccines, because the world has never seen a vaccine being produced in the kind of timelines that we're talking about. I mean, we've already seen companies apply for emergency use authorization. Today, we've heard from AstraZeneca. What should we be mindful of, and how should we interpret when you say 90% efficacy, 94% efficacy, 70% efficacy? What does that mean to a layperson?
It means that we prevent 9 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 potential infections. It's as simple as that. Vaccines prevent disease. And the key things we have to look for in vaccines, which is what regulators are responsible for ensuring, is quality, which comes from the manufacturing process, efficacy, which comes from the clinical trials, and safety, which comes from the trials themselves, but also from post-marketing surveillance. So once a vaccine is licensed under emergency use or full licensure, the process of monitoring the performance of the vaccine does not stop there, both in terms of prevention of disease and in terms of safety. Once the vaccine is being used, its performance will continue to be monitored by regulators and researchers. If we have anything to be proud of in this pandemic, it is how well science has done. Whether that is the preparation of diagnostics, or as Dr. Guleria pointed out, making PPE or anything else, we've done well. Vaccines is where we have done exceptionally well. And we need to take pride in that.
Okay. Absolutely, and perhaps that will give the world a new path when it comes to vaccine development. You're saying that we've done exceptionally well on that front. We could have continued with this conversation. There is so much more to learn, to understand, and to change, but unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you very much, Dr. Gagandeep Kang, Dr. Chandrakant Lahiriya, Dr. Randeep Guleria, for sharing your thoughts with us here on the program and in your book, Till We Win. And we do hope that that together we will win this battle with COVID-19. Appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18. What we've been waiting for, vaccine update from the Oxford AstraZeneca phase 3 trials. Data announced today shows that the vaccine has an efficacy of 90% when given as half a dose followed by a full dose at least 1 month apart. Another dosing regimen has shown 62% efficacy when given as 2 full doses 1 month apart. What is good news, especially for India, is that the AstraZeneca vaccine is cheaper, easier to store, deliver, and importantly, easier to produce in large quantities. The Serum Institute of India, the world's largest vaccine maker by volume, has partnered with AstraZeneca, the Gates Foundation, and the Gavi Alliance to produce more than 1 billion doses of this vaccine for global supply. 40 million of the doses are already manufactured, and distribution will begin once regulatory approval comes in. Joining me now to take us through where things currently stand for the AstraZeneca Serum vaccine, their partnership in India, I'm joined by Adar Poonawalla, the CEO of Serum Institute. Many thanks, Adar, for joining us here. This was the data that we were waiting for after we heard from Pfizer and Moderna. Now, can you explain to us how this works? Because there are 2 different dosages. One dosage gives you a 90% efficacy and the other 60%.
Yeah, Shireen, actually, you've summarized everything so well, there's very little to say. But I think one way to look at it is that we're definitely going to have a vaccine that will be more than 70% effective. Once the regulators take a look at it and the final trial gets completed, we'll probably finalize on the dosage regime. You know, the other advantage is that if half a dose given by a full dose is there, you can benefit, you know, in terms of the financial burden also being reduced by that much. Now, how much that will go down pro rata, we don't know, but you know, that's also a positive. Again, the other part we must take away, if you read all that's coming out, that there were 0 hospitalizations in the group that were vaccinated, which means that the vaccine is very effective. In fact, 100% in terms of dealing with severe cases of the disease developing in your system. So that's again also a very big positive. And another takeaway, which has not come out in these announcements, is that it's brought down by 60% the spreading of the virus, which means you're getting sterilizing immunity, i.e. what that means in layman's terms is that, you know, the vaccinated group does not go on and still keep infecting others, even though they are protected. Now, we don't know what that data is in the other vaccine candidates, and that's very important. Just because you're protected, you can still infect other people. But in this vaccine, you know, that's been reduced by 60% as well. So we'll have to wait and see. And, you know, to really understand whether a vaccine is effective or not and how effective it is, you have to go into hundreds of millions of people. And only then do you know, once in a particular region or a country where everybody's been vaccinated or a large part of the population's been vaccinated, how effective the vaccine really is. You know, these trials are just an indicator, a few thousand people, and then you've got a few hundred cases out of that which have developed COVID, and then you make your statistical analysis.
Yes, I would imagine that we will get more data as this is actually put out in the market. But Adar, what is the process now? Because we're given to understand that emergency use authorization will be sought pretty much immediately. How long before you know, AstraZeneca, Oxford get the regulatory approvals in the UK? And what is the status of the trials in India?
So as we can imagine, in the next few weeks, the emergency approvals license procedure in the UK should be granted by the MHRA. Fortunately for us, we've been able to connect the Drug Controller's Office of India with the MHRA directly. So we're trying to do that in tandem and have a free exchange of information, you know, in real time as that comes about. And that should definitely speed up the process. With regards to our trials in India, we're going to combine some of the data that we've also got, because by the 14th or 15th of December, we'll have definitely crossed 2 doses for everyone that we had enrolled in our trial in India, despite the delays and the initial stoppage that was there temporarily. So we should have a good sense of that data as well to be submitted in combination, and that's the dossier that we'll be working on in the next coming weeks, to be able to have also an emergency use licensure, you know, by the end of the year, as we had always tried to get done. Of course, How many doses, when it'll reach everybody, that's of course another question.
Yeah, so I just wanted to get a clarification. You're saying that by the 14th or 15th of December, you should have trial data here in India that you will submit to the regulators. But you cannot go ahead with putting the vaccine into the Indian market till the trial is complete here in India. Just on the back of clearances and the trial being complete in the UK, you will still need to wait for regulatory approval here, right?
No. So let me break that up in two. The final approval to give it into the general population, which means everybody and anyone can take it, will come probably at the end of January or February, because that's when the Indian trial will be completed. But the data points, the initial follow-up from the safety to basic immunogenicity data for the Indian trial should also be available in December. So when you submit that along with the UK data, that's enough for an emergency use authorization in India. And that's what we're all trying to work towards, so that we can start protecting the elderly in India and the most vulnerable, the front line workers and others that the government of India is going to identify state-wise. And we've been talking to them on how to give that. So again, it'll be limited use, but it'll still be a few 100 million doses, followed by a full licensure probably coming at the end of February.
So when do you expect the limited use of the vaccine in India, Aadhar, if all goes as per plan?
As we originally forecasted, end of December, early January, because, we were all waiting for the UK announcement for the efficacy in this data to come out, which it has. That was the first milestone. The second milestone is their application for the emergency use in the UK. Once that's granted, things in India will move far quicker and probably, hopefully, in tandem. That's what we're trying to do.
Okay, you've already been manufacturing at risk, Aadhar. Can you give me an update on, the kind of stockpiling that's already happened?
I think you mentioned a figure which was around 40 to 50 million, which is accurate. And we can scale that up or down, very quickly now, because we've standardized the process. So it'll all depend on how soon we feel we're going to get the licensure. We don't want to make too much too early and assign a shelf life, because that has other repercussions. So we'll probably hold a lot of it in bulk form and fill finish only when we get visibility that, we're weeks away from a licensure, because don't forget, from the time of being licensed and the logistics, it's going to be 2 months before it reaches all the other parts of the country. And then you've got to keep it for the first dose for people, then for the second dose. So there's going to be a few months that you need to have a good shelf life for the vaccine. And we're estimating a couple of months, close to 6 months, most probably, which is what the initial shelf life figures are looking like. And of course, in 2 to 8 degrees, which is a very nice temperature, which has got ample cold chain infrastructure that we've checked in India all throughout the country.
Okay, so you said that the shelf life should broadly be about 6 months for the vaccine. Let's talk about distribution as well as what the current capacity is. You said that you don't want to stockpile too much ahead of the regulatory clearances. But once the regulatory clearances come in, what kind of capacity can you deploy?
So we've already indicated at the highest levels to the government who are planning all this and the different departments that we can certainly supply up to 400 million doses by July 2021. Initially it may be in smaller volumes, and then once we reach sort of February, March, that can really pick up. And maybe we're talking 100 to 200 million doses by February, and then we can give almost more than 100 million doses per month after that. So, by July, which is when we're trying to target at least 400 million doses, which is what even the government departments have indicated, at least for the first dose, and then the second dose would follow a month after that.
Okay, so 100 million doses a month is what you're hoping for, which means that by July of 2021, you hope to have about 400 million doses. But let's talk a little bit about pricing as well, because this is much more affordable in comparison to a Pfizer or a Moderna. Do you believe that with volumes, you will be able to bring prices down even further? Or are we looking at that $3 price cap as being the price, at least in the foreseeable future?
No, so we always had an option to start at $10, $15 like all these other companies, and then pass the benefit on, as we increase the volumes. But we decided that our volumes are so large that our country needs, and COVAX that we've signed up with, as you know, and we're talking about at least 1 billion doses by the end of 2021, which seems to be on track. We can pass on that cost benefit of economies of scale from day one, and we want it accessible and affordable to not only India, but a lot of other countries which have budgetary constraints as well, whether it's Bangladesh, African countries, Nepal, so many others. So that's why we said we'll give it at $3 from day one for government supplies, but then 500 to 600 rupees in the private market where one can afford, of course, that kind of price, which is still very affordable, and probably 1/3 still of the multinationals from the West that have priced it at $20. Moderna, we heard, is more than $30. So that's where we're looking at the pricing, and we've assigned the MRP to be 1,000 rupees on the box. So that gives a margin to the traders and other private distributors to also earn something. But we'll probably end up only getting about 500 to 600 rupees in the private market. But those volumes will be very small compared to the government supplies, which will be in hundreds of millions.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you. You said that the MRP on the box for private use will be 1,000 rupees. But, will this be readily or easily accessible for private use in the market? And when do you expect that to be? Because I would imagine that there will be an advance purchase agreement signed with the government, which will, at least in the initial period, take up most of your quantity. Correct.
So if you tie up with the earlier point that I made, that the full licensure, the ultimate licensure for use in the general public will probably come in February or March. That is when we will launch or start looking at launching it in the private market, because that means you're not only authorized, but also by then we'll have enough volumes to give to the private market. And that ties in nicely with the timelines of supply for the government initial supplies that they want in the large volumes for the emergency use only for the most vulnerable people. So that's when that'll happen, probably, as I said, end of February, early March.
Okay. Adar, I want to talk about where the discussions currently stand on distribution, because unlike Pfizer and Moderna, which require cold chain infrastructure that India doesn't have, because you are able to store the vaccine between 2 and 8 degrees, it makes it much more practical for India to be able to distribute it. Now, there was a meeting that the Prime Minister had over the weekend on the vaccine procurement and distribution strategy. What have been the talks with government on procurement and distribution?
Well, at the moment, they're largely talking to us and maybe some other manufacturers. I think, all the ones that you mentioned, which are close to completing their phase 3. But I really can't comment on how far they've gotten with those guys, because, we're at this price level and volume requirement that, as you mentioned, practically speaking, one is the price. The other is the cold chain infrastructure that India doesn't have. So, I can't paraphrase, but it's going to be very difficult for them to look at any other vaccines, at least to begin with, which fit and tick all these boxes. So, I think at the moment they'll probably have to deal mainly with us, but I, again, can't comment on what they're doing. You'll have to check with them on how far their discussions have gone. All I can say is they've indicated to me that they're looking at 300 to 400 million doses to be procured, and we'll probably have an advance market commitment from them very soon, especially now that we've got these results. Before that, it was a bit difficult.
Haven't they already? Don't you have a draft advance purchase agreement that is waiting to be formalized or finalized with the government?
No, we're talking to them about it, but we have no draft and nothing so far in place. We're having very good discussions with them, but nothing signed as of yet. Otherwise, of course, everyone would know about it. We've done this at our own risk, and that's where, Bill Gates's funding was very crucial, because without that, I would have never been able to reach the $700-800 million that we've had to invest in CapEx and OpEx to come to this scale of operations. So, I think we also were hedging our bets against probably other vaccines, which may or may not have been better. But now it's very clear that at least for India and Africa, based on the affordability, the cold chain, and so many other factors, there's going to be very few options available for anyone to choose from.
So, Adar, will you be talking to other governments or other, commercial establishments, or will all of that be routed via Gavi?
Well, we're having our bilateral conversations, and we're, also going to be involving the Indian government in what we're talking about vaccine diplomacy, and see where we can work with them to help nations that, we're close to and want to cooperate with, and whoever reached out to us. So we'll see how that goes. But generally speaking, for Africa at least, we're going to submit our tenders and everything to COVAX, and that's going to be the nodal point, which will, with UNICEF, Gavi, and WHO and CEPI, decide how to distribute in an equitable manner the initial volumes coming about. So, when I said July 2021, we're talking about even supplying some volumes, maybe 100 or 200 million doses also, in addition to India, to COVAX as well. So we'll see how to balance that, as I've said, in an equitable manner.
So I just wanted to clarify that you're free to do bilateral agreements. Other as Serum, you can tie up with other governments if you like, or it doesn't necessarily have to go through COVAX or tie-ups that AstraZeneca does.
I can, because we have the exclusive rights to do whatever we want in these 68 countries, including India. The only reason I haven't done too much of that, except with one, which is Bangladesh, just for 30 million doses, and that'll probably be signed in the next few weeks, if at all it gets signed. But, I've stayed away from that because initially I want to take care of my own country, which has a huge requirement, and of course COVAX, and then we can look at more bilateral agreements. I think it would be irresponsible right now to commit more volumes to anybody and then just make them wait, for 6 months after that. So that's why I've stayed away from it. Although there've been very tempting offers of advances and other things, it's very important that we take care of our country first and then go on to COVAX after that, and then other bilaterals. So I've kept it in that priority.
I would imagine that there are many who have sought to ink advance purchase agreements with you, Adar. But I also wanted to get a clarification. The 1,000 rupee MRP on the box that you spoke of, is that for both doses or just the single dose?
No, it's for per dose. So if you imagine a 10-dose vial, it'll be a 10,000 rupee MRP. So it's per dose. And of course, as I said, that's just the upper limit that a doctor might charge after, and the distributors, after taking into account their margins. Because don't forget, we need also the help of private distributors and the medical ecosystem to distribute vaccines, in addition to what the government has planned, to reach everybody, because the government locations may not be able to reach everybody. So that's why we need them to also earn something in this, so that they can help and facilitate and take care of their costs, and of course make some profit in that as well.
Yes, I would imagine that you will require the might of the government infrastructure as well as the private sector's infrastructure to ensure that there is efficient distribution. But Adar, let me end then by asking you about what you foresee now. As I mean, this is the news that we've been waiting for. It's a positive development that's come in from the trials. But what do you foresee as the big challenges as you now start to go to market?
I think initially, one challenge was always that, will people want to take the vaccine? In my opinion, that's the only challenge left now, because initially it was which technology, which vaccine will work, if at all, will it be 60, 70, 90% effective? I think that's been answered. Will the manufacturing be enough? High volumes, high quality, I think that's been addressed. Will the governments be able to afford the vaccines? I think that's been addressed. So now the challenge is only public acceptance, I would say. And I would say that to an extent that unless we have blind public acceptance and trust in the healthcare system and what the scientists are advising you to do, we're going to be in a situation where, you know, everything is being addressed, but we're not reaching that high coverage of vaccine coverage, which is what you really need to get ahead of the pandemic. If you want to bring down the infection, you want to bring down the transmission and the disease burden in your healthcare systems, you want to open up businesses and come back to work. We need to trust the scientists who are going through all the data and then advising and deciding that this is approved, this is safe, this will protect you. And if we don't take that advice and do it, then, you know, we'll have not achieved the real target, which is high vaccine coverage over the next 2 to 3 years. I see that as the main and only challenge possibly now that is in front of us, with so many good vaccines, great vaccines being licensed as well.
Adar, you know, you spoke about one of the challenges being the penetration and the coverage, but so far, of course, the data that has emerged from all of these trials proves that these vaccines are not just have efficacy, but they're also safe to use. But is that at all a concern? The fact that, you know, we've seen this this expedited timeline that we're working with, and all of these vaccines are going to be out there in the market. You know, no adverse events reported directly linked to the vaccine, but is that a concern that you have? Because as you pointed out, that, you know, this is a few thousand people, a couple of thousand people that have been part of the trials, but is that something that manufacturers like you are worried about?
No, of course. I'll answer that in two parts. One, at least with the AstraZeneca Oxford product, you know, with the Ebola vaccine and past vaccines that they've made and other products, using this platform, the safety was always established. So we have far more safety data with this product compared to others. That's one very clear thing. And that was one of the major reasons, if you remember when I mentioned earlier why we chose to partner with them. That was a very attractive part, you know, compared to other things being equal, which is why we did partner with them very early on. That was one. And of course, there's going to be a 6-month to a 1-year follow-up for all these patients and others who are being vaccinated for us to really monitor even the long-term safety. So can I say without a doubt, is it 100% safe like that? Nothing is 100% safe. Only 6 months to a year follow-up will tell us that. But so far, in the thousands of people, if you haven't had any severe reactions or side effects, I think it's very safe to say it's a very safe vaccine, one of the safest vaccines out there. Even if you compare to the vaccines that you know, are licensed today, we don't have that kind of data even for the existing vaccines. You know, those trials have traditionally been far smaller in their numbers, and they haven't caused any serious issues because, you know, let me tell you, if there is a safety issue, a serious safety issue, it'll show up very early. With these kind of this kind of monitoring and follow up, but we must still wait. I think another 6 months to follow up and then look at that. And I must stress again that this technology platform that AstraZeneca and Oxford have developed was used in the Ebola vaccine and so many others in the past. So that's an additional bonus that we have as far as safety data and assurance, you know, that we all can, you know, have.
Sure. So Adar, I'll end by asking you, you know, you quoted a number of 80,000 crores as that would be the amount required for the government to be able to ensure that there is a high degree of coverage. It raised many eyebrows, created many headlines. So given where things currently stand, now that you are ready, virtually ready to launch, what kind of requirement, budgetary requirement do you foresee?
So I won't go to an exact number, but if you look at the comment that I had made at that time, the reason it was spot on was because, you know, the vaccine prices that were being announced at that time, and even today with Pfizer, Sanofi, GSK, whoever else, Moderna, which are more than even $30. If we were talking about hundreds of millions of doses and all those are 2-dose vaccines as well. Even if I launched my vaccine at $3 or $4 because I'd made up my mind at that time, I don't want to make too much money in this business during the pandemic. I want to be able to offer the lowest possible price to the public that I can. Even then, if you looked at vaccinating the entire population, which is what I assumed at that time we would want to do, that's what the figure was. Now, if we're talking about vaccinating half the population with 2 doses, of course the budget's going to be halved. And of course, if the majority of that vaccine is going to be bought by from vaccine manufacturers at $3, then of course, thanks to that, the budget would come down significantly. So one can make different combinations in your mind, on these different hypotheticals and then come to a conclusion. But it's certainly going to be a very high number. And look, it was not based on the pricing that I was going to give. It was based on the pricing, assuming that they would buy from other vaccine manufacturers. And of course, the logistical cost, the medical cost of all the doctors and nurses who would have to administer it, the cold chain, all of that put together.
All right, Aadar Poonawalla, we will leave it there. Appreciate you joining us here with a whole host of answers to many of our questions. Thanks very much, as always, for your time. Appreciate you joining us, and we wish you the very best of luck as you get ready for the regulatory approvals and then finally the launch. Thanks, indeed.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Well, we'll take a quick break. There's a lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere. We're back in a moment.